The wind tore through the empty fields like it had a mind to punish. Snow had crusted hard along the fence posts, and the sky hung low, the color of unwashed wool. Below it, a woman knelt near the -2, trying to fix the hinge on the chicken coop door. Her bare fingers shook. The nails she held kept slipping, falling into the crusted slush at her knees. Her name was Ruth, though nobody had said it out loud in some time. She was near 30, but the skin around her eyes had tightened, not from age, but from the constant narrowing against sun, wind, and loss. Her hair, once the color of burnt chestnut, had grown dull, the kind of brown that looked grayer in the cold light. Inside the house, if one could call it that, her children were quiet. Too quiet. That kind of silence came only when hunger had moved past its sharp edge into something softer. Sleep, i.e., more dangerous. They had eaten the last of the oats yesterday morning. That night, she'd split the final potato 3 ways. Today there was nothing. A crow and it on the post beside her. It cocked its head and made a low sound in its throat. "Go on," she muttered, voice hoarse. "I ain't nothing left for you either." Her breath caught on the last word. She stayed crouched, head down, blinking against the sting in her eyes. But it wasn't just the cold. When James had died the previous spring, H.E.D. left her with 4 acres of stubborn dry land, 2 hungry boys, a girl barely out of swaddling, and no real plan. He hadn't meant to leave them, but meaning didn't matter much to a mule's kick or a broken neck.
She rose slowly, legs trembling, and turned her back on the coop.
The wind pushed her coat open. It wasn't much of a coat anymore, the buttons long gone, fabric worn through at the elbows. She pressed her arms around herself and trudged toward the house. Inside, the wood stove sat cold and empty. The walls were thin, and the roof still leaked in the back room. Ben, the older boy, was wrapped around his sister, trying to keep her warm. Luke, the younger, sat on the floor near the stove, poking at imaginary embers with a stick. "Ma," he said without looking up, "you think Pa sees us from heaven?" She didn't answer right away. Her throat felt raw again. "Maybe," she said finally. "Maybe he does." Luke nodded. Then he looked up at her. "I'm awful hungry." She walked to the cupboard and opened it, though she already knew it was bare. Her eyes traced the empty shelves like they might find something she missed. Then she pulled the door shut and rested her forehead against the wood. Time was running out.
The snows had come early this year.
The last trip to town was weeks back, and that was to trade the wedding ring for flour and lard. It hadn't lasted. There was talk that a supply wagon might pass through on its way west sometime soon, maybe within days, but Ruth knew how fast talk could turn to dust. And the horse was gone, traded for firewood last month. She had no way to fetch help. Her fingers twitched against the cupboard door. She had never begged. Not once. Not when James died. Not when they lowered his body into the half-minus frozen dirt with nothing but her shawl to wrap around the box. Not when the neighbor boy had come sniffing around with whiskey breath and crude promises. But she had never watched her children starve before either. She turned. The children were watching her now quietly, as though afraid their hunger might offend her. She smiled weakly and went to the hearth. "Luke," she said, crouching beside him, "go get the pail. We'll fetch snow and melt it for soup. I ain't nothing to make soup with." She brushed his hair back from his forehead.
"It's all right."
"Warm water will do for now." She watched him go, watched the door swing open and the white light spill in behind him. For a moment, she thought about following him out and not coming back. But then she heard a sound, quiet at first, then louder. Hoofbeats, real ones, coming down the ridge. She stood quickly, heart thudding in her chest. She opened the door wider, stepped out barefoot into the snow.
Her breath smoked in the air.
A figure on horseback moved toward her, dark against the white. Not a mirage, not a ghost. He stopped some 30 feet away, said nothing. She didn't move. The wind howled past them, and still the stranger stayed. He dismounted slowly, as if aware that any sudden move might send her bolting back inside. The horse shifted under him, breath steaming, nostrils flaring at the scent of wood smoke and fear. The man was tall, broad across the shoulders, wrapped in a thick buffalo coat that had seen better years. Snow clung to the hem. His hat was pulled low, shadowing most of his face. But his hands were bare, red from the cold, fingers chapped and draw like hers. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her, then past her to the sagging porch, the cracked door frame, the smoke-minus less chimney. "You Ruth Callahan?" he asked finally, voice low and worn. Her lips were too dry to answer. She nodded. He pulled something from the saddlebag, a bundle wrapped in canvas tied tight with cord. He walked forward and laid it on the porch without a word, then stepped back. "From Joseph Hart," he said. "Said to get it here before week's end." The name caught her like a slap. Joseph Hart.
The preacher from Sweetgrass.
A friend of James once, though he'd not shown his face since the funeral. She dropped to her knees and untied the bundle. Inside, God help her, was food. A small sack of beans, cornmeal, a half slab of bacon, stiff with salt, a wrapped jar of something dark, probably jam. Her fingers moved over the items like they were relics. She couldn't speak.
The man cleared his throat.
"Said you was old." Still kneeling, she looked up at him. His face was lean, lined deep around the eyes. Maybe mid-30s, older than he looked. Or maybe just worn down like the rest of them. "I can't pay," she said, voice hoarse. "Not now. Was asked to take pay."
Behind her, Luke peered from the doorway, snow clinging to the hem of his trousers.
The stranger saw him and nodded once. "Him staying west of here by Willow Creek. A lined shack I patched up." He gestured toward the horizon. "Not far. Snow's deep, though. He'll come by in the next day or so. Make sure you got firewood." She rose slowly. "You don't need to." "I do," he said, quiet but firm. "Your husband helped me once years back, and I don't forget things like that." She watched as he mounted again. He didn't look back when he rode off, just headed toward the white blur of the horizon until the horse and rider were swallowed whole by the snow. The sky had begun to darken. She gathered the bundle in her arms and carried it inside. Ben gasped when he saw what she held. Luke let out a whoop that startled the baby awake. They ate that night. Not much, but enough. Later, when the children were sleeping and the wind had stilled some, Ruth sat by the stove, listening to the faint crackle of burning twigs. Her hands were wrapped around a tin mug of hot water. She stared into the small fire, thinking not of the man, but of James, how he used to rub warmth into her fingers after long days. And yet, when she closed her eyes, it was the stranger's voice she heard, quiet, level, like someone who had lived through the same kind of cold. She didn't expect him to return. Folks said things. Promises faded. But the next morning, as the snow lightened and the day stretched wide with silence, she saw smoke rising from the trees to the west. If you're still listening, subscribe and keep going. 3 days passed before he came back. In that time, the food had held barely. Ruth had stretched the beans with snow water and onion peel, fried thin cakes from cornmeal, and sliced the bacon as if it were gold. Each time the children finished eating, they looked at her with a little more light in their eyes, as if they trusted she might still keep them alive. The morning he returned, she was outside chopping ice from the rain barrel with a flat bladed shovel. Her hands ached. Her shoulders were stiff from sleep. She hadn't dared burn much through the night.
But when she heard the crunch of hooves again, she straightened to fast and nearly lost her balance.
He came from the same direction, slow, unhurried. This time he had a small sled tied behind the horse, and on it sat a bundle of split wood and another canvas sack. He nodded once as he drew up near the porch. "You look better," he said. Ruth didn't answer. Her eyes were on the wood. He dismounted and lifted the bundle without waiting for permission, carried it to the -2 and began stacking the logs neatly beside the wall. "You got a saw?" he asked over his shoulder. She hesitated, then went inside and returned with the dull buck saw James had left hanging behind the door. The handle was cracked, the blade rusted at the edges. The man took it, turned it in his hands, then nodded like it would do. "You'll cut what's dry, then see about the back fence. Looks like something got through." "You don't have to," she started, but he cut her off with a glance. "I don't do it for you. I do it for the kids." The words weren't unkind, just simple, flat, like a fact that didn't need arguing. She bit the inside of her cheek and looked away. After a moment, she said, "What's your name?" He didn't answer right off, just set the saw down and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a pair of gloves. "Call me Clay," he said finally. "Clay Merrick." Merrick. She rolled the name in her mouth. "You knew James. Long time ago. Rode fence together for the Dalton Ranch down south. He looked out for me when I was green and stupid." She watched him bend and lift another log. He moved like someone used to labor. Nothing wasted. No need to prove anything. The children came outside then, drawn by the smell of wood and the motion of a man working. Luke stood on the porch in his stocking feet, wide mine aside. Ben hung back, weary. Ruth pulled hers all tighter around her shoulders. Clay worked for over an hour without saying much. When he was done stacking and sawing, he brought the second sack to the door. Inside were 3 more potatoes, a jar of lard, a square of hard cheese wrapped in wax paper. "I can't keep taking this," she said. "It's too much." "I told you," he said, voice steady. "It's out." He turned to leave, but she stepped forward. "Won't use it? Just for a moment. There's water heating."
His eyes flicked past her to the door, then to the children still watching.
He gave a slight nod. Inside, he sat on the edge of a chair near the stove while Ruth poured hot water into tin mugs. She had steeped a few pine needles in the pot, trying to stretch the memory of tea. He didn't comment on the taste, just drank, nodding once. "You always stay out by Willow Creek?" Ben asked him. The boy had come to sit beside the stove, face half minus hidden behind his knees. "For now," Clay said. "Plan to keep moving, but the snow said otherwise. Do you got family?" He looked down at his mug, then up again. "Not anymore." The room went quiet. Ruth didn't press. She knew what silence like that meant. She knew the weight of it, how it settled into the bones like cold. After a while, Clay stood. He glanced toward the window. "Storm coming. Light one, but cold. Keep the fire going." Then he was gone again. That night, Ruth sat long after the children were asleep. The fire was steady now, warm enough to peel back the chill. She stared at the door. Her fingers rubbed unconsciously at the rim of her cup. The snow had begun to fall again, soft, slow, like a lullaby. The wind rose around midnight, slow at first, then bitter.
Ruth woke to it pushing against the walls, groaning through the gaps in the roof boards.
She wrapped herself in the old quilt and checked the stove. Still burning, but low. She added 2 more pieces of wood, careful not to wake the children. The baby stirred but settled again. One fist curled beneath her cheek. The next morning, snow banked against the door. It took Ruth nearly 15 minutes to clear a path wide enough to open it. The world outside had gone white and shapeless. The sun had not yet broken through the cloud cover, and the air held a sharpness that bit at her cheeks. She stood there a moment, letting it hit her, cold and clean and real. She didn't expect to see him again, not after that last storm. But just before noon there was a knock. A real knock, 3 hard raps on the frame. When she opened the door, Clay stood there again, covered in snow, holding a battered tin pail. "Rabbits too," he said. "Huh. Figured you might not say no today." She stepped aside before she could think too much about it. The warmth from the stove rushed past her toward him. He set the pail down on the table and shook the snow from his shoulders. The children had already gathered, eyes wide at the smell. Luke reached the table first. Ruth ladled the stew into bowls. Real meat, soft potatoes, carrot slices so bright they looked out of place. The first spoonful nearly made her cry. "You didn't have to," she said again, quieter this time. "I know." He didn't sit right away, just stood near the door, watching the meat like he was part of it. Finally, at Luke's insistence, he took the empty chair and let Ruth pour him a mug of pine tea. They ate mostly in silence, save for the clinking of spoons and the low sighs of children filling their bellies.
Afterward, Clay reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin.
"Got something else." He opened the lid. Inside were matches, a spool of thread, some salt, a few hooks and a bit of line. "Figured you might make use of these," he said. "Stream behind the ridges got fish once the ice breaks." Ruth took the tin, hands trembling just a little. She turned it in her palms like something precious. "I don't know what to say." Then done.
They didn't talk much more that day.
He helped her mend part of the fence where the post had split from frost. She showed him the old barn, now leaning into the earth like it had given up. He looked over the roof, the beams, the leftover planks. Might be able to patch some of this, he said, if the thaw comes early. That night, after he left, Ruth stood at the window long after dark, watching the trees sway. Her shoulders were sore, her hands raw, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel hollow. Something had settled inside her.
A small steadiness.
She found herself thinking about his hands, the quiet way he moved, like he didn't want to startle the air, and the way he looked at the children, not like they were someone else's, but like they were real, worth the trouble. In the days that followed, Clay returned again and again. Sometimes she brought wood, sometimes just tools or news from Sweetgrist. Once, a book for Ben. Another time, a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lion cedar. He never stayed long.
He never expected things.
But slowly something changed. One afternoon, as they worked side by side clearing brush from the back fence, Ruth looked over at him. "You could stay," she said, not looking directly at him. "When the thaw comes, help with the land. It's hard on my own." He wiped his brow and squinted into the light. "I might," he said, "if you want me to."
And that was all.
Spring came late, dragging its heels like an old man reluctant to change. The snow melted in slow fits, leaving behind patches of brown grass and broken earth. The creek behind the ridge began to move again, sluggish at first, then faster, clearer. With it came birdsong, the kind Ruth hadn't heard in so long she'd forgotten it could make her smile. The mornings were still cold, but they no longer bit straight to the bone. Ruth rose earlier now, stirred not just by duty but by rhythm. The children were growing stronger. Their cheeks carried color again. Their laughter had begun to return, not all at once, but in shy pieces like fawns stepping out of the trees. Clay came most days. By then, he no longer gnawed. He brought lumber scavenged from an old hunting shack and used it to brace the barn's failing roof. He showed Ben how to sharpen a blade, how to listen for the hollowness in a log before cutting. He never spoke about where he'd been before all this, or what had driven him toward the empty corners of Montana. But sometimes in the evenings, when the work was done and the light hung soft across the plains, he'd sit with Ruth on the porch and talk about horses he'd ridden, rivers he'd crossed, places that no longer meant anything. There were no grand declarations between them, just small gestures that settled deep. The way she handed him the tin cup first, how he brushed snow from the porch steps before she stepped out. A glance, a silence filled with something warmer than words. One night, after the children had gone to sleep, they stood outside watching the stars fight through the clouds. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Starting somewhere new?" He was quiet for a long time. The wind had a soft edge that night, like it had tired of hurting. "I did," he said finally. "Used to think if I just kept moving, it'd find some place that didn't hurt so much." "Did you?" He shook his head. "I stopped moving." She turned to look at him. "That because of me?" He didn't answer, just looked at her in that steady way he had. She thought he might kiss her, but he didn't. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it like it was something breakable. Weeks passed. The land thawed more each day. They tilled a patch of ground behind the house and planted seed potatoes and carrots. Ruth taught Clay how to mend a shirt. He showed her how to catch trout with a simple hook and line. She watched as her children began to look to him not as a replacement for James, but as something different, a new kind of steady, a quiet shape in the doorway when the wind picked up, the sound of boots returning at dusk. But it wasn't all easy. One Sunday, a man rode in from town. Clay was outside splitting wood.
Ruth was inside kneading dough.
The rider called out without dismounting, "Clay Merrick." Clay stepped out into the yard, axe still in hand. Ruth watched from the window, hands stilled in flour. The man wore a deputy S badge, though his coat nearly hid it. His eyes never left Clay's face. "You've been seen near the Harmon place last winter. That fire, they say it was set." Clay didn't flinch. "I wasn't anywhere near Harmon." The deputy sniffed. That what him supposed to tell the widow who lost half her cattle in the barn. You can tell her I was in Willow Creek patching up a line shack. With no one to back you up?" Clay said nothing. The deputy looked past him toward the house, toward Ruth, then back. "You settle here." "Am helping," Clay said. "Helping can look a lot like hiding." The man turned his horse and rode off without another word. Clay stood in the yard a long time before going back to work. That night, Ruth found him by the fence line, staring west. "You want to tell me what that was?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "I ran with some men I shouldn't have. Left when I saw where it was headed. Didn't stay to watch the damage."
Did you set that fire?
"No," he said, "but I left before it was put out." She waited, letting the silence stretch. "I should go," he said finally, "before trouble comes knocking again." Ruth stepped closer. "Or you could stay and stop running." He looked at her, then truly looked, and something in his face cracked open, just enough. "All right," he said, "you'll stay, if you'll have me." She nodded once, slow. "Then we start tomorrow." Spring turned into summer without ceremony. The grass stretched long and green across the hills, and the children ran barefoot through the fields, their laughter rising above the soft clatter of wind in the cottonwoods. The days grew full of work, of small comforts, of things mended and planted and planned. Clay built a pen for the chickens and patched the floor under the girls' bed. He didn't talk much about the deputy's visit, and Ruth didn't push. What mattered was that he stayed. Each day he was still, there was a kind of promise. The nights were warm now. The fire burned less. Ruth took to sleeping with the window cracked open. Sometimes she'd lie awake listening to the sounds of Clay moving outside, the scrape of boots, the quiet closing of the barn door, the soft snort of the horse settling down. She wondered if he stayed up thinking like she did. Wondered what haunted him when it was just stars and silence. One evening after supper, he handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it with careful fingers. It was a deed and signed with her name at the top. Beneath it, a blank line where another name could be added. "I sent for this," he said, if you wanted something more official. If not, it doesn't change anything." Ruth stared at the page for a long time. She didn't cry, but she felt the weight of it in her chest, how it folded over the ache that had lived there for so long. She looked up at him, standing there awkward and quiet like a boy too tall for his own skin. "He'll sign it," she said, "but not tonight. Tonight we sit, watch the light go down." So they did. A week later, Ben asked if Clay would teach him how to shoot. Ruth had kept James's rifle locked away in a chest, untouched since the day they buried him. She fetched it without ceremony and handed it to Clay. "You shoot straight," she said, "and you teach him to do the same." They set up bottles behind the shed and practiced until the boy's shoulder ached. Clay didn't rush him, didn't bark orders, just stood behind, correcting his grip, steadying his breathing. When Ben finally hit one, the sound cracked through the valley like thunder. The boy whooped, and Ruth smiled so hard it hurt her cheeks. A few days later, they went to Sweetgrass as a family. It was the first time Ruth had left the land since James died. She wore a clean dress and brushed the dust from the baby's hair. Clay hitched the wagon and helped her climb, and like it was Sunday morning on day she'd always done it that way. People stared. Some whispered. Ruth felt it like nettles on her skin. But Clay held her hand under the bench seat, and when they stopped outside the mercantile, he said, plain and steady, "Let him talk. You've got nothing to hide." It was just a town rip. They'd gone to speak with Joseph Hart, the preacher, who'd sent the first bundle that saved them. He met them on the church steps, hat in hand, his eyes lighting up when he saw the children. "I heard," he said, "you've taken on help." Ruth nodded. "More than help." Clay said nothing, just held the baby while the older two ran circles in the dusty yard. Joseph looked at her. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure." The next Sunday, Ruth stood in a warm dress with her children by her side. Clay stood beside her, one hand steady at her back. The vows were simple. No rings, just words spoken true and quiet in front of the handful of folks who mattered. Afterward, they shared bread from the wagon bed and coffee poured from a dented tin. The sun warmed her neck, and someone she couldn't remember who laughed loud enough to make the baby clap. That night, back on their land, they stood together outside the house. The sky was wide and deep with stars. You never asked why I left the others, Clay said. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. I left because I wanted to build something, not run from things. You are, she said. You're rebuilding it right now. Inside, the children slept soundly. A garden waited to sprout. A barn stood straighter than it had in years. Ruth leaned into him, her hand resting just below her belly. She hadn't told him yet, not because she was afraid, just because she liked holding the secret a little longer, like a lit coal warming her from the inside. Soon, the wind stirred the grass in long, slow waves. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. Another dawn waits ahead. Subscribe to see it.